Elias had buried 3 seasons of failed crops before the stranger arrived. Each season was a fresh wound. First, the blight, which turned his vibrant potato leaves into black lace. Then, the drought, which cracked the earth like shattered pottery, stealing his corn before it could tassel. Finally, the floods, which washed away the topsoil and every last seed of hope with it. His hands, once strong and sure, now felt like clumsy tools of failure. His land, a sprawling inheritance of rich, dark soil, lay silent and choked with weeds. Before we continue, let know where you are watching from. Thank you. Now let's move on. He was sitting on his porch, watching the sun bleed across the horizon in hues of orange and defeat, when a cart rattled up his dusty lane. The man driving it was tall and thin, dressed in a suit that seemed too fine for the countryside. He moved with an unsettling grace. "Elias the farmer?" the stranger asked, his voice smooth as polished stone. Elias simply nodded, his gaze heavy. "I have heard of your troubles," the man said, stepping down from the cart. "And I have brought you a solution, a guarantee." From the back of the cart, the stranger produced a plant. It was flawless. Its leaves were a perfect, deep emerald, glossy and untouched by any blight. Its stem stood straight and proud, and nestled among the leaves were buds that promised a fruit of unimaginable beauty. It looked more like a jewel than something that grew from the dirt. "This," the stranger announced, holding it aloft, "is the Everbloom. It requires no special soil, no complicated care, just water, sunlight, attention, and in time, it will bear a fruit that will change your fortune forever. A fruit that tastes of success itself." A flicker of something long dormant stirred in Elias's chest. Hope. It was a dangerous, seductive feeling. He looked at the perfect plant, then at his fields of tangled weeds and barren earth. The choice felt simple. One was a picture of guaranteed success. The other, his voice raspy. The stranger smiled, a thin, knowing curve of his lips. "Nothing. Consider it an investment in your future." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Elias with the perfect plastic plant. The first year was a year of devotion. Elias built a small glass house just for the Everbloom, ensuring it received the perfect amount of sunlight, shielded from the harsh winds and the unpredictable rain. He watered it every morning, measuring the water precisely. He'd wipe dust from its immaculate leaves with a soft cloth, whispering words of encouragement to its unhearing ears. His neighbor, old Samuel, would lean on the fence, his own fields bursting with life, and shake his head. "Elias, what about your land? The rains have been kind this year. It's not too late to till." "This is a sure thing, Samuel," Elias would reply, his eyes fixed on the glossy green leaves. "No pests, no blight. It's perfect. Why would I wrestle with the dirt when I have a guarantee right here?" The weeds in his fields grew taller, becoming a tangled, thorny forest. The soil beneath grew hard and compacted. 5 years passed. Elias's back was more stooped, the lines on his face etched deeper by time and unwavering focus. The Everbloom remained unchanged, perfect, pristine, and barren. The buds never swelled, never flowered. The whispers in the village grew louder. "He's lost his mind," they'd say, watering a dead thing while his birthright turns to dust. His devotion soured into obsession. He saw mockery in the chirping of the birds and judgment in the rustling of the weeds. The plant was no longer a promise. It was a challenge, a testament to his patience. He couldn't give up. To admit defeat now would be to admit the last 5 years of his life. His energy, his hope, his very essence had been wasted on a lie. He doubled his efforts, sometimes rising in the middle of the night to check on it, to ensure it was safe. He was no longer nurturing a plant. He was guarding a fragile piece of his own sanity. The 10th year arrived with a storm. It wasn't a gentle rain, but a violent, tearing gale that ripped shingles from his roof and howled like a grieving animal. Elias spent the night in the glass house, his frail body braced against the door, shielding the Everbloom from the tempest. When dawn broke, the world was washed clean and broken. The storm had passed. Elias, exhausted but triumphant, turned to his plant. It stood, as always, perfect and unharmed. But the storm had done one thing he hadn't accounted for. A stray branch, hurled by the wind, had shattered a pane of glass at the back of the greenhouse. And there, on the floor, lying on its side, was the Everbloom. The pot had cracked, and the plant had fallen out. Elias rushed forward, his heart pounding with panic. He knelt, his old knees cracking in protest, and gently lifted the plant. And then he saw it. There were no roots. The stem ended in a clean, flat, molded edge of green plastic. He turned it over in his trembling hands. He tapped the leaf. It made a faint click, click, click. He ran a finger down the stem and felt the hard, artificial seam from the mold it was cast in. It wasn't real. It had never been real. The air left his lungs in a gut-wrenching sob. 10 years. 10 years of his life, poured into a piece of decorated plastic. The sun, the water, the whispered hopes, all wasted. An acidic wave of shame and regret burned in his throat. He looked past the shattered glasshouse, at the decade of weeds that had consumed his fertile land. He had been watering a lie, while a real, living world of possibility withered from neglect just outside his door. The weight of it all crushed him. The wasted sunrises, the ignored rains, the foolish hope. He let the plastic plant fall from his numb fingers. It clattered onto the stone floor, the sound echoing the final, hollow beat of his broken spirit. He stood up, turning his back on the glasshouse, and the symbol of his monumental failure. He took one step, then another, walking towards the edge of his property, ready to leave the wasteland of his own, making behind forever. But then, something made him stop. A tiny, almost imperceptible fleck of color near the shattered pane of glass. It was a flicker of impossible green against the gray stone. He squinted, his tear-filled eyes struggling to focus. Pushing up through a crack in the foundation, in the one spot where the relentless storm had washed away a decade of dust, was a single, tiny, perfect sprout. Alive, real, and utterly alone. For a long moment, Elias did nothing. He simply stood there, a hollowed-out man on a barren patch of his own making, staring at the tiny sprout. His first instinct was bitter irony. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. After a decade of devotion to a lie, a real and living thing appears, but only in the wreckage of his failure. It felt like a final, mocking joke. He was tempted to crush it under his heel, to wipe away this tiny, insignificant life, just as his own significant life had been wiped away. But he didn't. He took a slow, deliberate step closer. He knelt, his joints groaning in protest, bringing his face so close he could see the delicate veins on its two minuscule leaves. It was imperfect. One leaf was slightly smaller than the other. A tiny speck of dirt clung to its stem. Unlike the Everbloom, it was flawed, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Hesitantly, as if afraid it might vanish, he reached out a trembling finger and touched a leaf. It was soft. It was fragile. It was alive. A warmth spread from his fingertip through his entire being, a current of life he hadn't felt in 10 years. This tiny plant wasn't asking for a decade of blind faith. It wasn't promising a magical fruit. It was just growing. Against all odds and a crack in the stone, it was simply, stubbornly living. Something shifted within him. Not a sudden wave of hope, but a quiet, profound turning. The 10 years of wasted effort were a debt that could never be repaid. The shame was a shadow that would likely never leave. But shame was a story about the past. This sprout was a story about the present. His movements, at first, were stiff and uncertain. He cleared the shattered glass and debris from around the tiny plant. He pulled away the nearest weeds, his hands raw and clumsy. He found a few loose stones and built a small, protective circle around it. It was not a grand glass house. It was a humble, broken fortress for a life just beginning. That evening, for the first time in a decade, he did not water the plastic plant. He took his watering can, filled it with fresh water from the well, and gave a few gentle drops to the tiny sprout. It was a prayer in liquid form. The next day, he did not look at the sprout. He turned his eyes to the field, to the monstrous, thorny weeds that stood as a monument to his folly. He grabbed a rusty scythe from the barn, its handle slick with the dust of neglect. The work was brutal. The thorns tore at his clothes and his skin. The roots were deep and stubborn, clinging to the earth they had claimed. Every weed he pulled felt like an apology. Every drop of sweat that fell onto the compacted soil felt like a tear of repentance. His back screamed, his hands bled, but he did not stop. He was not just clearing a field. He was clawing his way back to life. A week into his labor, a familiar figure appeared at the fence line. It was old Samuel. He didn't mock or chide. He simply watched for a long time as Elias fought the wilderness he had allowed to fester. Finally, Samuel called out, "The soil is hard, Elias. It needs to be turned." Elias paused, leaning on his scythe, too exhausted to feel shame. "I know," he panted, "but the weeds must go first." The next morning, Elias awoke to the rhythmic clatter and groan of a plow. Samuel was there, hitched to his old, steady mule, breaking apart the hard, unforgiving earth that Elias had started to clear. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for thanks. He just showed up, and as the dark, fertile soil was turned over for the first time in 10 years, revealing the rich potential that had been sleeping underneath, Elias finally wept. Not for what he had lost, but for what he was so undeservedly being given, a second chance. Seasons turned. The work was slow, but it was real. Elias planted potatoes, corn, and beans, simple, honest crops. He watched them grow, celebrating every new leaf, every tentative bud. There was blight on some leaves. Pests nibbled at others. The harvest was not miraculously abundant. It was humble. It was modest. But when Elias pulled the first potato from the dark, rich soil, he felt its weight in his hand. He brushed off the dirt and saw not a promise of magic, but the result of sun, rain, and his own hard work. That evening, he boiled it with a little salt and took his first bite. It didn't taste like success. It tasted like the earth. It tasted like redemption. It tasted real. The plastic everbloom was not thrown away. Elias took it from the broken glass house and placed it on the windowsill in his kitchen. It stood there, perfect and unchanging, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder. A teacher. He had learned the hardest lesson of all. Life's greatest rewards do not come from flawless, guaranteed promises that ask for our passive attention. Those are often just beautiful, hollow distractions. True growth, true fulfillment, is almost always found in the imperfect, unpredictable, and sometimes difficult soil right in front of us. It is found in the messy, challenging, and often ignored opportunities that require our actual effort. We must be careful what we choose to water. For a single, living sprout in a world of weeds is worth more than a forest of perfect plants that will never, ever grow. It is the soil of our own lives, fertile with ignored possibilities, that is waiting for the rain. The most important question this story leaves us with is this: what plastic plant might you be watering in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone for subscribing. If this story resonated with you, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more cinematic lessons that challenge the way you see the world.